unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. This is a special bonus episode of Grand Tamasha. As many of our listeners will know, for the past 5 years and change, I've interviewed authors, journalists, policymakers, practitioners, people who are working on contemporary India in a bunch of different ways. And I've tried to give listeners across the globe a glimpse into what life looks like in the world's most populous country. And what we've done over the past 2 years, anticipation of a little hiatus that we take during the winter holidays, is we've published an annual list of our favorite books featured on Grand Tamasha over the previous 12 months. This is this year's edition. We want to keep the tradition alive. And so here, in no particular order, are our favorite books of 2024. I'm going to talk about 3 books that I really enjoyed over the last 12 months. I want to start with a book by the historian Janaki Bakhle, published by Princeton University Press. The book is called Savarkar and the Making of Hindutva. It seems like in today's era of BJP dominance right now in India, there are relatively few historical figures whose writing, whose polemics, whose thinking help explain the current ideological moment more than Savarkar does. He was in some ways, hard to pin down. He was an intellectual, he was an essayist, he was an activist, he was a revolutionary, he was a poet, an anti-colonial leader. But I think, whatever way you wish to describe him, it's clear that his writings helped to inspire today's Hindu nationalist movement. There have been a lot of biographies of Savarkar in recent years. It's hard to even keep up with the ones that come out each year. But of the ones that I've seen, I think few can compare with, the depth, with the kind of texture, with the thoughtfulness, really, of Janaki Bakhle's, definitive work. There are a lot of analysts and political observers who look at Savarkar as a kind of unidimensional, Hindutva ideologue, right? And I think what Bakhle does is to remind us that Savarkar was first and foremost, above all, a leading public intellectual in the state of Maharashtra. And his foundational work was not in English or in Hindi, but actually in Marathi, the regional tongue. And what she does over many hundreds of pages is to really kind of excavate this treasure trove of Savarkar's wide-ranging writings in the original Marathi, which she speaks and reads and writes fluently. From his historical essays to poetry to political speeches he gave. And, what emerges over the course of this book is a kind of a shift, a move away from the kind of black and white portrayals that we typically receive of Savarkar to something much more gray, something where you have shades of gray, much more nuance. She doesn't shy away from Savarkar's controversial views on Hindutva and on Hindu supremacy, but she also turns our attention to his less known avatars, right? Savarkar was also an anti-caste progressive. He, in some ways, was a pioneering advocate for women's rights. He was a patriotic poet, right? So this is an extremely complicated picture of what can only be described as a complex man. He was an atheist, but at the same time, he confronted Hindu conservatives. Later on, he emerged as their flag bearer, right? He, in some ways, in many ways, he was virulently anti-Muslim, but also remarkably progressive, especially for his time and place on issues like caste, right? He birthed a political movement that ended up turning into the BJP. But he was as interested in some ways in literature and aesthetics and art as he was in politics. So Whether you love Savarkar or despise Savarkar, I think Janaki Bakhle's book can't really be ignored, and it's really worth your time, especially if you want to try to understand some of the intellectual foundations for this era of BJP dominance that we live in today. I want to share a clip with you from my conversation with Janaki, and this was really on the question of caste, and how Savarkar saw caste, and how his views on caste really distinguished him from many of his colleagues of the time.
And his most radical claim is to say, and this is extraordinary, to say that if you actually looked at the Vedas and you looked at the Mahabharata and you looked at the Ramayana, you have a kind of caste mixing, what we might call miscegenation, from the very get-go. There is nothing like a pure caste. And we are all, and by we, he means, the community of Hindus, right? But he also includes the community of Muslims for the sort of basic reason that all Muslims are converts. Yeah. And so in India, everyone is, by that definition for him, either a Hindu or a potential Hindu. But apropos of caste, certainly the idea that there is nothing like pure caste and there is nothing like a pure Brahmin. And he uses in incredible ways a kind of literary historicist reading, okay, of the Mahabharata, which tells you that Vyas would be an untouchable. And so how is it that Vyas, an untouchable, could write the Mahabharata of all things, yes? He'll tell you that he points out the number of hands from which Ram in the Ramayana will take food, okay? And so, in a sense, he turns, much as he does in Essentials of Hindutva, he turns these characters from epics into his sort of, shall I say, weapons of reform, weapons of caste reform. And yes, it is instrumental. But I would not go so far as to say, therefore, it was not principled, in part because I think all reform is instrumental.
So the second book that I want to highlight on our top books of the year is a really massive book, but really massive in kind of every way. It's a book called Accelerating India's Development, a State-Level Roadmap for Effective Governance. It's by the economist Karthik Muralidharan. It was published by Penguin Viking India. I'm pretty sure that most listeners of this podcast have read Karthik's work, heard Karthik speak, or listened to him on another podcast. Over the past couple of decades, there have been few economists globally, really, not just those who are working on India, who have been as prolific or as plugged into the world of development policymaking as Karthik Muralidharan. He is the Tata Chancellor's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. He has published on issues ranging from, teacher and health worker absenteeism to the use of biometric smart cards, to, behavioral nudges for administrative employees. In this book, he tackles some of the most important and vexing development policy questions that I think plague India and many other developing countries like India today. And this is based on years and years of his own research, right? Where he has published in top econ journals on issues like teacher performance pay, school vouchers, smart cards, laptops in schools. In some way, this is a culmination of a career's worth of work, which sounds a bit strange because Karthik, at least by my count, hasn't even hit the age of 50 yet. But it's really a testament to what he's been able to do in that short period of time. Don't get intimidated by the size of this book. It is over 800 pages. That includes 200 pages of notes, which refer back to the literature on which Karthik's claims rest. But across this massive terrain, he takes readers on a really exhaustive deep dive into India's governance challenges, especially when it comes to delivering essential public services. this book draws on a wealth of research, but also practical insights that offer very concrete kind of evidence-based suggestions for reform. Karthik, over the years, has developed a rather encyclopedic knowledge of development policy in India. And I think his book is a testament not just to his research, which is pretty impressive of its own accord, but also to his various attempts over the years to try and nudge the Indian state to behave more efficiently and more effectively. So you might imagine in a book like this, Karthik covers kind of standard topics in development policy, right? In development economics, health, education, social protection. But what really impressed me is that the book also goes beyond that. It goes into areas that typically have been seen as sort of the province of political scientists, right? Things like the justice system, the police, rule of law issues. I feel pretty confident in saying that this book is destined to become a go-to reference on India and development policy more broadly for many, many years to come. This is a book that takes, a lot of ambition. It takes a bit of audacity. I think, Karthik has both, but he also has this, 25-year plus record of academic research to back it up. I want to play you a clip from our conversation, which took place in the spring of this year, in which I asked Karthik to kind of define what state capacity means to him. It's one of these evergreen buzzwords that we hear in our lexicon these days when it comes to, how do we fix India's governance challenges? I think most people think, well, we need to have more state capacity, which I think is right. But it's never really clear what exactly that means. What does it measure? How do we really pin this down into something that's more operational? Here's what Karthik had to say.
One of the problems or the challenge of state capacity, of defining state capacity, is you can define it in both absolute terms and relative terms. Okay, so in certain absolute measures of state capacity, India does great, right? Measures of political stability, measures of elections, measures of central bank, macro fiscal management. So there's many things where India does great, but there's other things where we're not doing great. And I think the way in my mind I make sense of this is that, broadly speaking, state capacity or organizational capacity is the capacity of the organization to fulfill the goals it takes on, right? And so in a world where and then when I say we haven't invested adequately, what I really mean is that we haven't invested adequately relative to our democratic goals. And then, which highlights a key point in chapter 2, which is India's unique trajectory of kind of early universal franchise democracy kind of expands the ability of people to make a claim on the state before the state has the capacity to meet those claims. Okay, so broadly speaking, state capacity is just the capacity of the state to deliver what its kind of political process says it should be doing. Okay, so and then we get so that's the conceptual definition. And I think one of the intellectual advances of the book is that often scholars of state capacity try to measure state capacity by looking at certain outcomes. Okay, so there's this famous example of sending a letter with an incorrect address to 150 countries and seeing does it come back, and using that as a measure of the capacity, because that's of the postal system. But I think the problem, it's useful, but it's a little tautological, right? Because you're measuring the capacity by the outcomes, and that doesn't tell you how do you actually improve the capacity. So again, I think what the book is doing is responding to the call of people like Devesh Kapoor, who've kind of noted that scholars should be looking at the state not just as an institution, but as an organization. So as an institution, you look at how it performs. As an organization, you get into the black box of this beast and saying, so let's understand why it is or is not effective, and how do you improve that?
Hey, Grand Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grand Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. The third book and the last book that I want to highlight this year is a book called The Identity Project, The Unmaking of a Democracy. This is by the journalist Rahul Bhatia. The book is published under a different name in the US and the UK. There it's been published under the heading, The New India, The Unmaking of the World's Largest Democracy. I think many of our listeners would probably recognize Rahul's bylines. He's written everywhere from The New Yorker to The Guardian to The Caravan. He's had some pretty celebrated profiles of everyone from the television news personality Arnab Goswami to the former head of the cricketing world in India, and Srinivasan. He's also taken on the kind of mysterious, some would say shady business empire of yoga guru Baba Ramdev, as well as India's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This new book, The Identity Project, was featured on the New York Times list of 100 notable books of 2024. And I think what the Times recognized, and I think, I feel this way too, is that this is a book based on a lot of ground level research and reportage. In fact, Rahul spent 6 years researching this book. And I think, to put it very simply, he set out on a quest to understand the sort of ideological moorings of what we have come to call the kind of new India, right? This new kind of, ideological quest of the BJP government. And the title of Bhatia's book actually in some ways is a double meaning, right? It's a double entendre. The book is about two things. It's about the country's quest to establish its own identity in the 21st century amid all of these cross currents, globalization, domestic social churn, economic liberalization. But it's also a book about identity in a different way, quite literally the Indian government's efforts to provide every resident with a unique biometrically authenticated identification number, of course known as Aadhaar. And so what you get is this very eclectic book that takes you from riot-torn neighborhoods in eastern Delhi. These were places that saw really bad violence in 2020 to, the kind of sterile government bhavans where India's apex, bureaucrats sit. The precise linkage in this book between the two forms of identification are not necessarily always very clear, or I should say they can be very contested. That is the precise linkage between Aadhaar and today's ascendant Hindu nationalist movement. But even if you leave those connections or those contested connections aside, this is a book that paints a very disturbing portrait of kind of what it looks like to unleash majoritarian democracy. One of the most notable things about this book is just how well Rahul writes. I mean, he has these incredible portraits in his book. For instance, one of a Muslim resident of Delhi named Nisar, who is seeking justice for a really awful communal violence he witnessed in 2020. There's another chapter that looks at the daily life in Ashaka, which is this kind of local organizational hub of the BJP and the RSS. Bhatia spent time in Ashaka as an outside observer. There's also some great kind of historical reportage on leaders like L.K. Advani, right, who was the kind of BJP hardliner who, unbeknownst to me, was the person who actually came up with this idea of an all-India identification number back in the 1990s, which is a story that had been kind of lost to time until Bhatia kind of resurrected it. Ultimately, this is a book with a lot of really vivid reportage that illuminates a lot of these kind of subterranean battles that are taking place, not always clear to the kind of naked eye, but whose outcome will ultimately shape kind of India's democratic future. The last clip I want to play is from my conversation with Rahul. I ask him about the Aadhaar biometric identification scheme. And, there have been so many criticisms over the year of Aadhaar. But what's never been clear to me is, what is it that people are losing sleep over? What is it that they're so worried about, given that people every day in their daily lives, both personal and professional, are giving all kinds of data to all sorts of entities, including, the Googles, Apples, Metas of the world? What is it about Aadhaar that he felt was truly important and perhaps truly questionable? Here's what he had to say.
Aadhaar is tremendously powerful. That one number that identifies who you are is a very, very powerful tool when it is attached to other data, to other databases. It really does reveal a lot about you. And given the fungible nature of data, this is the sort of stuff that we all should be stopping and looking at and thinking, wait, where does this go? And I'm afraid right now we're not really thinking about these things. We've said Aadhaar is a great tool. Don't get me wrong. I'm actually, when I think about Aadhaar as a tool for convenience, it's fantastic. I like it now. But the idea of it disturbs me. And the idea of it disturbs me primarily because of the country we live in. Because data, its protection, is not taken seriously enough. We don't. It's also about who is held responsible. It is about the way the judiciary works, the way law enforcement works in this country. And so when you take all these things into account, you say, here's a number that can identify me, identify my bank accounts, identify my tax number, is a de facto tax number as well. A lot can be found out about me. And when you involve the coercive powers of the state, it's unsettling.
So there you have it, Grand Tamasha's 3 favorite books of 2024 in no particular order. Savarkar and the Making of Hindutva, written by the historian at University of California, Berkeley, Janaki Bakhle. Then we had Karthik Muralidharan's book, Accelerating India's Development, a state-level roadmap for effective governance. And last but not least, Rahul Bhatia's new book, The Identity Project, The Unmaking of a Democracy. This is the final episode of our 12th season, believe it or not. We are going to take a little bit of a break. We will come back in the middle of January with our brand new 13th season, for which we're already doing some planning and thinking. Thank you so much for being loyal listeners of the show. Thank you so much for sending us your ideas and giving us your feedback. Hope you have a wonderful holidays and see you in the new year. Grand Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grand Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grandtamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.